My husband and his daughter used me. The house was unusually quiet that evening. Our son was at a friend's for a sleepover, and I'd been busy putting away laundry, my mind wandering over all the small things that had piled up this week. I paused at the door to Jake's study, a basket of freshly folded towels in my arms. Through the door, I could hear his voice, low and amused, drifting out into the empty hall. Then came a softer laugh, Jessica's. Jessica hadn't laughed like that in a long time. That sound alone made me hesitate, caught somewhere between curiosity and the uneasy feeling that something was off. I adjusted the towels in my arms, staring at the faint light from under the door. I knew I should have just moved on, gone upstairs and put the towels away, left them to whatever they were talking about. But I couldn't. Not after how distant things had felt between me and Jake lately. Not after he'd started spending so much more time with Jessica since she'd moved in. I leaned closer to the door, straining to make out their words. I only caught bits and pieces, Jessica's voice a low murmur, something about plans and timing. Then Jake laughed, the kind of laugh he used to say for our inside jokes, the ones that only the two of us would understand. A knot tightened in my chest, and I took a slow, deep breath trying to steady myself. Moving away from the door, I made my way back to the kitchen, setting down the towels on the counter and pressing my palms against the cool marble. I told myself that I was overreacting, that I was reading too much into a simple conversation. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'd been bending over backward, trying to bridge the gap between Jessica and me ever since she'd moved in. I'd invited her to go shopping, cooked her favorite meals, tried to bond over silly little things like reality TV and recipes. I'd even spent some of the inheritance money on a nursery for her baby, hoping that it would make her feel more at home here. Yet she barely said thank you, brushing me off with cold smiles and disinterested nods. My mind drifted back to when Jake had first asked me to set aside a portion of my inheritance for Jessica. It had been a long day. I'd just come home from settling some of my grandmother's affairs and was still reeling from the emotional toll of it all. Jake had come to me, his face so sincere, and said, "Sarah, don't you think we could use some of the money to help Jessica get on her feet? I know she's not always easy, but this could really make a difference for her." I had hesitated, unsure. I'd told him I wanted to use the inheritance for our son's college fund. Maybe a few upgrades around the house, but nothing too extravagant. But Jake had looked at me with such a hopeful expression, practically pleading, and I'd felt selfish for even considering saying no. After all, Jessica was family now, and despite our differences, she was his daughter. My heart softened, and I'd finally agreed, telling myself that it was a small price to pay to help mend the strained relationship between us. But now, standing in the silent kitchen, something felt different. The trust I'd given Jake so easily was starting to feel fragile, like glass with a hairline crack I hadn't noticed before. The next morning, I woke early. The uneasy feeling from the night before lingered like a shadow, trailing me as I made my way downstairs. The house was still and quiet, the kind of peaceful I'd once cherished. I used to think of our mornings as sacred, a time when I could sip coffee in the soft light by the window, feeling grateful for our life together. But this morning, something felt different, hollow almost. As I brewed my coffee, I heard the faint click of the study door opening, followed by the sound of Jake's footsteps padding softly down the hall. He must have been up late working. Or maybe he'd been talking with Jessica again, the way they did sometimes, long after I'd gone to bed. I wondered what they discussed behind closed doors. Ever since Jessica had moved in, they seemed to share an understanding I wasn't part of, like they were bound by some invisible thread that didn't include me. I turned back to the coffee machine, listening as Jake entered the kitchen, his movements casual, as if everything was perfectly normal. He glanced over at me and gave a quick smile. "Morning," he said, reaching for a mug. I nodded, feeling my own smile come out forced, strained. "Morning." We stood in silence, sipping coffee, watching the sun climb higher outside the window. It felt like one of those mornings when something needed to be said, but neither of us knew how to start. My mind flashed to the conversation I'd overheard, the sound of Jessica's laugh mixed with his. The knot in my stomach tightened, and before I could stop myself, the question slipped out. "So, What were you and Jessica talking about last night? My voice sounded casual, or at least I hoped it did. Jake paused, the mug halfway to his lips. A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise, maybe, or annoyance. It was hard to tell. Oh, nothing really, he said, lowering the mug. She was just stressed about the baby, wondering how she's going to make it all work. I was trying to give her a little pep talk, that's all. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering doubt that wouldn't quite go away. Maybe I was just being paranoid, overthinking things that didn't matter. But still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something out. Are you happy she's here with you, Jake? I asked, my words slow and careful. Jake gave me an odd look, his brow furrowing slightly. Of course, I'm happy. I mean, it's not easy for her, Losing her mom, being pregnant, it's a lot. I just want her to feel like she has a safe place here. There was a weight to his words, and yet they didn't feel quite sincere. He'd been so insistent about Jessica staying with us, so adamant that it was the right thing to do, even though he knew how strained things were between her and me. He kept saying it was a matter of family, that she needed us, but I couldn't help feeling like there was more to it. She does have a safe place here, I said softly, searching his face for any sign of reassurance. I want to make sure we're all on the same page, that's all. Jake gave a half smile and shrugged, dismissing my words with a wave. Of course we are. Don't worry so much, Sarah. Jessica will come around eventually. But his words felt hollow, like he was brushing me off. I could feel the old ache creeping back in, the familiar feeling of being pushed to the edges of my own life. I watched him as he turned his attention back to his coffee, staring into the mug as if it held some secret he couldn't, or wouldn't, share with me. And that was when I decided I needed to know. That day, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on, something beneath the surface that Jake wasn't telling me. The worry gnawed at me all morning, until finally, after lunch, I found myself standing alone in the hallway outside his study. The door was closed, just like it had been the night before when I'd heard them talking. I took a breath, debating whether I should just leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed answers, anything that would put my mind at ease. I pressed my hand against the door, feeling the cool wood under my fingertips. What was I really looking for? Some proof, maybe, that I was just being paranoid. Or maybe confirmation that the doubts I felt were real and that I hadn't been imagining everything. I slowly turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The room was exactly how Jake left it, neat and orderly, like he was hiding anything that might look out of place. His laptop sat closed on the desk, the screen dark. I hesitated, staring at it for a long moment, my heart pounding. With a shaky hand, I lifted the lid and the screen flickered to life. I half expected it to be locked, but to my surprise, it opened up without any password prompt. A familiar background photo of our family filled the screen, a picture from a few years back when our son was just a toddler. We'd taken him to the beach for the first time, and he'd laughed at every little thing, full of innocence and wonder. Back then, I thought we had everything we needed. I snapped myself out of the memory and forced my attention back to the screen, clicking through his recent files. There were spreadsheets, a few emails, and some folders labeled with work projects. I was about to close it when an open browser tab caught my eye, tucked beneath the others. It was a chat window, and as I clicked on it, a conversation popped up, one between Jake and Jessica. Their messages filled the screen in neat, mocking lines, words I couldn't have imagined even in my worst moments. They were laughing, talking about me like I was some kind of joke, someone gullible and easily manipulated. Jessica had sent messages about how convenient it was to have Mom Sarah around for finances, how she wouldn't have to worry about anything once the baby arrived. And then Jake's response appeared below hers, cold and cutting. She'll give in. She always does. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the words. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I read it again, hoping I'd misunderstood, that maybe I'd missed some context or that this was some kind of awful prank. But the messages were right there, in plain sight, and they said everything I didn't want to believe. I sank down into Jake's office chair, my mind reeling. Everything. Their shared looks, the way he'd insisted she move in, the subtle pressure he'd put on me about the inheritance. It all fell into place, but in the worst possible way. They'd been using me, laughing behind my back, planning how to make me give more, sacrifice more, while they took everything without a second thought. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I felt the hot sting of tears, but I swallowed them back. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, snapping a few screenshots of the conversation before closing the laptop. I couldn't let Jake or Jessica know that I'd seen this. Not yet. But in that moment, I knew there was no going back. That evening, I went through the motions of dinner, barely tasting the food on my plate. Jake sat across from me, talking about something from work, something ordinary and unimportant. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but all I could hear was the cruel laughter from that conversation replaying over and over in my mind. Jessica joined us halfway through, casually dropping into her chair with an air of confidence that seemed even more brazen now. She looked at me with that same cold, almost dismissive expression she always had, as if I were a stranger in my own home. The familiarity of this routine, the way we sat around this table every night like a normal family, felt unbearable. How many times had I sat here, worried over her, tried to make her feel at home, only to realize now that none of it mattered to her. I forced myself to say something, to break the heavy silence that had settled around me like a weight. Jessica, have you thought more about what you'll need once the baby arrives? Any plans for the nursery? My voice sounded strange, hollow even to me, but I hoped neither of them would notice. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a small, practiced smile. Not really. I mean, it's not like I'll need much if Dad's here to help, right? Jake glanced over at me, nodding in agreement. That's right. We got it all covered. And with the inheritance, it'll be a smooth ride. No need to stress about it, Sarah. His words struck me like a slap. I managed to hold on to my composure, but inside, anger bubbled up, thick and raw. How could he sit there so casually, acting like this was all just part of the plan, that he had a right to make these decisions without even asking me? He hadn't discussed anything with me, hadn't treated me like a partner. I was just the source of funds, the one he could rely on to keep things running smoothly without question. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. You know, Jake, I've been thinking about that. The inheritance is important, and I want to make sure we're all clear on how it'll be used. For the family, I mean. All of us. A flicker of discomfort flashed across his face, quickly replaced by a tight smile. Of course, Sarah. We'll talk about it when the time comes. He leaned back, his tone dismissive, as though it were a minor detail. I could feel him brushing me off, refusing to acknowledge my concerns. Jessica smirked, picking at her food. Yeah, Sarah, no need to get all worked up about it. You're always so cautious. The way she said my name, with that touch of mockery, made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep calm. I couldn't let them know what I'd seen, couldn't risk letting my anger show. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the candle in the center of the table, watching the small flame flicker and dance. In a strange way, that tiny light felt like the only real thing in the room. The rest of dinner passed in silence, and I couldn't bring myself to eat much. I kept my gaze down, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, trying to figure out what to do next. When Jake finally got up to clear his plate, I excused myself, saying I was tired. I slipped away to our bedroom, closing the door behind me and leaning against it, feeling a surge of relief to be alone. I took a shaky breath, letting the tension in my shoulders unwind, even if just for a moment. As I sat on the edge of the bed, my phone still clutched in my hand, I looked down at the screenshots I'd taken. The words on the screen blurred as my vision filled with tears. I could barely believe it was real, that this was happening in my life, in my marriage. But I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let them use me anymore. The next few days passed like I was in a fog. I went through the motions, waking up, getting dressed, working, cooking, cleaning, doing everything that was expected of me. On the outside, nothing looked different. But inside, I felt hollow, like a stranger drifting through my own life, watching from a distance as everything I thought I knew started to fall apart. Jake seemed oblivious to the tension building inside me. He went about his days as if everything was perfectly fine, laughing with Jessica in the mornings, texting her from the living room, and talking about the baby as if it were the most exciting adventure of his life. It was almost as if he had created this alternate version of our family in his mind, one where I was just a supporting character, a bystander funding his and Jessica's plans. I tried not to dwell on it, but every time I saw him with Jessica, laughing and whispering in the kitchen, the resentment grew. I found myself questioning everything. How I could have missed all the signs, how I could have convinced myself that this marriage was built on love and trust. Had I been fooling myself all along? On the fourth night after I'd found the messages, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Jake's steady breathing beside me. Sleep was elusive, and my mind kept turning back to those messages, replaying them over and over, each word etched into my memory. I felt trapped, held down by my own loyalty, my own trust. And yet, the thought of confronting him, of finally standing up for myself, made my stomach churn with dread. But then, as I lay there in the dark, a thought crept into my mind. I didn't have to go through this alone. My best friend, Claire, had been by my side through so many chapters of my life. She was the one person who knew me better than anyone, the one person who would understand. Maybe I could talk to her, let her know what was happening. At the very least, I could finally share the burden that was crushing me. The next morning, I picked up my phone and dialed her number before I could second-guess myself. I stood by the window, watching the early light spread across the yard as the phone rang. After a few moments, Claire picked up, her voice warm and familiar. "Sarah, hey, it's been a while," she said, a hint of concern in her tone. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, the weight of my emotions pressing down on me. "Claire, could you meet me for coffee today?" There was a slight pause. "Of course, hon, are you all right?" I just need someone to talk to," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll explain everything when we meet." "Absolutely. Just tell me where and when." We agreed on a small cafe downtown, the one we used to go to during our college days. I hadn't been there in years, but somehow it felt like the right place. Somewhere familiar, somewhere that held memories of a time when life felt simpler. Later that morning, I told Jake I had some errands to run and headed out to meet Claire. The drive felt endless, my heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and relief at the thought of finally telling someone. I pulled up to the cafe, parking in the back and taking a moment to gather myself before heading inside. Claire was already there, seated at a table by the window, her familiar smile breaking into one of concern as soon as she saw me. I slid into the seat across from her, feeling the warmth of her presence wash over me like a balm. "Sarah, what's going on?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice soft but urgent. I tried to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the screenshots, and handed it to her with trembling hands. Claire took it, her eyes widening as she scanned the messages, her mouth falling open in disbelief. "Oh my God, Sarah," she whispered, looking up at me with a mix of shock and anger. How long? How long have you known about this?" "A few days," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I still don't. She put the phone down and reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "Sarah, you don't have to go through this alone. You deserve so much better than this. They're using you, plain and simple. And you can't keep pretending everything's fine. You need to confront him." I nodded, swallowing back the tears that threatened to spill. "I know, but I needed to hear someone else say it." Claire squeezed my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. Whatever you decide to do, I'm here. You have every right to stand up for yourself, and I'll be by your side every step of the way." Sitting there, with Claire's hand in mine, I felt a flicker of strength, a tiny spark of resolve I hadn't felt in days. After meeting with Claire, I felt a new sense of resolve, even if it was fragile. I drove home with her words echoing in my mind, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in ages. "You deserve better." She was right. I couldn't keep living in this twisted arrangement, letting Jake and Jessica treat me like an afterthought, like I was just there to serve their needs. It was time to make a change, even if that meant finally confronting the truth. When I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Jake and Jessica had gone out for the afternoon. He left a note saying they'd gone to look at some nursery furniture. I laughed bitterly when I saw it, crumpling the note in my hand. I knew they weren't really looking at nursery furniture. They were spending my inheritance, planning their life around it as if it was theirs to use as they pleased. I made my way to our bedroom, suddenly exhausted, and sat down on the edge of the bed. My eyes drifted around the room, landing on the framed photos on our dresser. Pictures from our wedding, a few of our son, a family trip to the mountains years ago. Each photo felt like a memory of a life that belonged to someone else. I wondered if any of it had ever been real. As I sat there, staring at the life I thought we'd built together, I heard the sound of the front door opening and closing. Jake's footsteps moved down the hall, and a moment later, he appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Hey," he said, stepping into the room and leaning against the doorframe. "You're home early. Everything okay?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my tone casual. "Yeah, I finished up my errands sooner than I thought." I paused, watching him carefully, feeling the weight of the conversation I was about to have with him press down on me. "Jake, we need to talk." His expression shifted slightly, a hint of caution creeping into his eyes. "About what?" I took a steadying breath, trying to keep my voice calm. "About the inheritance. About what's been happening between us and Jessica." He looked away, shifting uncomfortably. "Sarah, we've talked about this. I told you, Jessica's part of the family now. She needs us." "Jake," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I'd expected. "It's more than that. I know what's been going on. I saw the messages on your laptop." His face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as he looked at me in shock. "Messages?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, holding his gaze. "Between you and Jessica. The ones where you were talking about how convenient it was to have me around for the inheritance, how easy it was to get me to pay for everything. You both laughed about it, Jake." I read every word. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find something to say. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and heavy, hanging between us like a wall neither of us could break through. "Sarah, it's not what you think," he finally managed, his voice shaky. "Jessica's been through a lot, and she doesn't mean everything she says. She's just frustrated, that's all." "Frustrated?" I repeated, my voice rising. "She's been living here, using my money, treating me like I'm just here to make her life easier. And you're telling me she's frustrated?" He flinched, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know it looks bad, but I swear it wasn't meant to be like this. Jessica's my daughter, and I just wanted to make sure she had a good life, that she felt safe after everything she's been through." "And what about me, Jake?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did you ever think about how this was affecting me? How it felt to give up part of my inheritance, my security, because you said it was for our family? Did you even care how much this was hurting me?" He looked up, meeting my gaze for a brief moment before his eyes slid away again. "Of course I care, Sarah. You're my wife. I thought you'd understand. Jessica needs us. She's family." His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I could barely breathe. "So that's it?" I whispered. "You think it's okay to use me, to let her use me, because she's family?" Jake didn't answer, his silence filling the room with a sense of finality. I felt a wave of anger surge through me, a cold, hard anger that left no room for doubt. There was nothing he could say to make this right. Nothing he could say to change the fact that he'd betrayed me, that he'd chosen Jessica's comfort over my trust, over the life we'd built together. "Jake," I said quietly, my voice steady now, "I'm done. I won't be used like this anymore. If you and Jessica want to live off each other, go ahead. But I'm not going to be a part of it." He looked at me, his face a mixture of shock and panic. "Sarah, wait, please. You don't mean that. I know you're angry, but we can work this out. Just give me a chance." I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. "I gave you so many chances, Jake, but you kept choosing her over and over again, no matter how much it hurt me. I can't do this anymore." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there in silence. I closed the bedroom door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, catching my breath. My heart was pounding, my whole body tense. But somewhere beneath the anger and hurt, I felt a surprising sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, I'd finally stood up for myself. I'd drawn a line that couldn't be erased or ignored. I walked down the hall and found myself in our son's room. His favorite stuffed animals were lined up neatly on the bed, and a stack of his storybooks lay on the nightstand, waiting for him to come home. I ran my fingers over the cover of one of them, the familiar feel of the well-worn spine grounding me, calming the storm raging in my chest. I knew I had to keep it together, for his sake. Whatever happened next, I needed to make sure he felt safe, that he understood that no matter what, he was my first priority. I pulled out my phone and dialed Claire. She picked up almost immediately, her voice warm and steady. "Sarah?" "I did it," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice from shaking. I told him I'm done. There was a beat of silence, and then Claire let out a long breath. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so proud of you. How did he take it?" He was shocked. He kept making excuses, kept trying to tell me that I just needed to understand Jessica, that it was all for her. But I couldn't listen to it anymore. I had to walk away. "You did the right thing," Claire said firmly. "I know it doesn't feel good right now, but you needed to say it. You deserve better than this." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I wiped it away, trying to hold on to the strength in her words. "Thank you, Claire. I don't know what I would have done without you." She gave a small laugh, her voice softening. "You would have figured it out, Sarah. You're stronger than you think. Just remember, whatever happens, I'm here. You're not alone in this." Hearing her say that made everything feel a little less overwhelming, a little less terrifying. We talked for a few more minutes, and by the time I hung up, I felt steadier, more grounded. I knew I had to keep moving forward one step at a time. I spent the next couple of hours packing a few essentials for me and our son. I didn't want him to come back to a house full of tension, to a mother who was constantly torn between anger and betrayal. He deserved more than that. I decided that we'd go stay with Claire for a few days, at least until I figured out what came next. Just as I was zipping up the suitcase, I heard the front door open and the muffled sound of Jessica's voice drifting down the hall. My whole body tensed, every nerve on edge. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm, to keep my focus on getting out of here as smoothly as possible. I walked out into the hallway, and there was Jessica, standing by the doorway with a shopping bag in one hand and a smug smile on her face. She barely looked at me as she slipped off her shoes, setting her bag down on the bench by the door. "Oh, you're home," she said, barely glancing at me, her tone dismissive. "I thought you'd be out running errands or something." I felt the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but I kept my voice even. "Jessica, we need to talk." She finally looked up, her brow furrowing as she studied my expression. "What's this about?" "About everything," I replied, my voice steady. "About how you and your father have been treating me. About the things you've said behind my back. I know what's been going on, Jessica. I've seen the messages." Her face went pale, the smugness vanishing in an instant. She crossed her arms, trying to keep her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice firmer now. "I've read every word you two exchanged. The jokes, the comments about my inheritance, everything. I know you think I'm just here to make your life easier, but that ends now." Jessica's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, she looked like she was going to argue, to come up with some excuse. But then, her mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "Fine. So you know. You've been so eager to play the martyr, to be the perfect wife and stepmother. I just figured, why not let you?" Her words stung, every syllable hitting me like a slap. But I held my ground, refusing to let her see how deeply her cruelty affected me. "I may have tried to help you, Jessica, but that doesn't give you the right to take advantage of me. You and your father can make whatever plans you want, but they won't include me. I'm leaving, and I'm taking my son with me." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her smugness turning to anger. "So what? You're just going to run away? You can't handle a little pressure?" I shook my head, feeling a surge of pity for her, mingling with the anger. "This isn't about pressure. It's about respect, something neither of you have shown me since the day you moved in. I've given enough. I'm done letting you both treat me like I'm just here to serve you. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway, her expression a mixture of shock and fury. I returned to our son's room, took a deep breath, and zipped up the suitcase. In that moment, I felt a strange kind of peace, a quiet certainty that no matter what came next, I was finally taking control of my life. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk, taking a last look at the house, where I'd played a role that no longer fit. Just as I climbed into the car, Jake hurried outside, his face panicked. He knocked on my window, and I hesitated, then lowered it just a crack. "Sarah, wait. You're not really leaving, are you?" he asked, voice strained. "Yes, Jake. I told you. I'm done letting you and Jessica use me." He shook his head, desperate. "You don't have to do this. I'll talk to her. Think about our son." I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steady. "I have thought about him. He deserves a home built on respect and honesty, not one where his mother's taken for granted." Jake's shoulders slumped, his frustration simmering. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Jessica's difficult. She doesn't mean everything she says. Stop making excuses," I replied firmly. "I've given enough." I took a steadying breath. "I'll be at Claire's with our son for a few days. Maybe space will make things clearer for both of us." "Fine," he muttered, stepping back, defeated. "If that's what you want." Without another word, I rolled up the window, started the engine, and drove away, feeling a bittersweet sense of relief as his figure faded in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally choosing my own path. The drive to Claire's felt endless, each mile stretching the distance between me and the life I'd known. When I arrived, Claire was waiting on the porch, arms open. She hugged me tightly, her warmth easing the tension that had settled in my chest. "You made it," she murmured, looking me over with concern. "How are you feeling?" "Relieved and terrified," I admitted. "It's like there's no going back." She nodded, understanding. "That's normal. Just remember, you're not alone." We brought my bags inside, settling in her guest room, which she'd prepared with fresh linens and flowers. My son seemed happy, playing with Claire's toys, his laughter filling the house. Watching him, I felt a mixture of grief and hope. Leaving Jake was hard, but being here gave me a glimpse of something better. Later, over tea, Claire asked, "So, what's next?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I think I need to talk to a lawyer. If this is the end, I need to protect what's mine and my son's." Claire squeezed my hand. "That's smart. You deserve security after everything you've been through." As the evening turned quiet, she looked at me, her voice soft. "Whatever you decide, Sarah, I'm here for you. You deserve a life where you're valued." Her words settled within me, giving me a strength I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, waking up in Claire's guest room felt both strange and comforting. My son patted in, rubbing his eyes. "Are we still at Miss Claire's?" he asked, curling into my hug. I nodded, relieved that he seemed happy and safe, telling me how much he loved her pancakes. After breakfast, Claire and I sat down to talk plans. I shared my decision to meet with a lawyer about protecting my inheritance and securing our future, and she handed me a few recommendations. Taking a deep breath, I dialed one number, feeling nervous but ready. When I scheduled a consultation, relief washed over me. A path was forming. Later, Claire, my son, and I spent the afternoon at the park. For the first time, I felt free to enjoy these moments with him, knowing that this decision was leading us to a better place. That evening, after tucking him into bed, I finally checked my phone, finding a series of messages from Jake. His tone shifted from casual to desperate, then accusatory. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this will hurt our son the most." His words stung, but I steadied myself and replied simply, "I need time and respect. I'm open to talking when you're ready to be honest." His reply came quickly, a cold "fine." Though his response hurt, I felt grounded. I knew that, while this was only the beginning of a hard journey, I was on a path toward a stronger, truer life. For now, I was moving forward. The next morning, I met with Meredith Chase, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. Claire had reminded me that this was just a step to explore my options, not a final decision, which helped steady my nerves. In her office, Meredith listened attentively as I explained my situation and fears. She reassured me that since I'd kept my inheritance separate, it would likely remain mine. For now, she recommended a legal separation agreement. It would protect me financially and give me space to decide without rushing into divorce. By the end of the meeting, I felt a weight lift. Meredith's guidance had given me the clarity I'd been missing. Driving back to Claire's, I realized that, for the first time in years, I was taking control of my future. I didn't know exactly where it would lead, but I was beginning to believe it would lead somewhere better. Returning to Claire's, I found my son napping peacefully, his little face a reminder of why I was doing this. To give him a life filled with stability and respect. Claire came out of the kitchen, her expression full of warmth. "How did it go?" she asked gently. I exhaled, setting my purse down. "Better than I thought." The lawyer suggested a legal separation. It's a pause, not final, but it's what I need to finally make my own decisions. Claire hugged me, her smile proud. "That's exactly what you deserve, to be in control of your life." As we sat down with tea, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "I'll give you space, but don't expect me to wait around forever. Jessica, and I don't need this drama." His indifference stung, but confirmed what I'd long feared. He'd never truly valued our marriage. I showed Claire, her face softening. "He's shown you who he is. Letting go is hard, but you deserve someone who sees you." The rest of the day drifted by in quiet moments. My son and I played in Claire's backyard, laughing under the warm afternoon sun. For the first time in years, I felt fully present, no longer burdened by doubts. That evening, watching the sky fade from amber to indigo, I realized I was done sacrificing myself for a marriage that gave nothing back. I typed a message to Meredith, ready to proceed with the separation. There was a future waiting, bright and unknown, but for the first time in years, I was ready for it.